Good morning. Or is it afternoon? No, it's still morning, all right. The title of the message this morning is The Power of Hope. And we're looking at 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 3. And it says this: Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Because of his great mercy, he has given us new birth into our living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead and into an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled and unfading, kept in heaven for you. So the book of 1 Peter was written by the Apostle Peter himself, and it was written when he was in Rome in around AD 67. And chapter 1, verse 1 tells us who he was writing this letter to. And it tells us he was writing to the strangers. These are exiles, basically, Christians that are scattered right across Asia Minor. And so what that means is Peter is writing to immigrants. He's writing to refugees, this scattered Christian population who face very real threats of persecution, verbal attack, physical harm, and the very real chance of genocide. And so he is writing this letter to people who are experiencing very, very difficult circumstances. They're going through a very, very difficult time in their life, and things must have been incredibly overwhelming for them. And what Peter does in this letter is he strategizes what Christian living looks like, how you function in effect, when you experience very difficult times. And what is interesting is his prescription for Christian living starts with the reminder of who they are, their identity. He starts by reminding them that they have been born again into a living hope, which we've just read. See, for Peter, truly understanding the hope that we have, that is central to Christian living. Peter understands that when we work from a place of knowing our hope, everything changes. The magazine Psychology Today published an article back in May 2014, and that was called The Remarkable Power of Hope. And in this article, it quoted research by a guy that was conducted by a guy called Kurt Richter, Professor Kurt Richter. And he conducted this research in the 1950s. Now, I have a disclaimer to make. I can't say that no animals were harmed in this, because they were. It was the 1950s. Ethically, things were allowed then that aren't allowed now. And so just for the record, I don't condone the harming of animals. I'm an animal lover. But it kind of really helps illustrate the point. So what Kurt Richter did is he conducted this series of experiments where he basically tested how long a rat could live for in a bucket of water before it gave up and drowned. It's pretty grim, isn't it? So he took 12 rats, he put them in 12 separate buckets of water, and he timed how long they would live for before they died. And he found that the average length of time that a rat would live for was 15 minutes before it was too exhausted and it gave up and it died. He then repeated the experiment again, obviously with 12 new rats this time. And this time, Jason nearly spat his coffee out. But this time what he did is just at the point that they were about to drown, just at the point that they were about to give up, he took them out of the bucket, he dried them off, he gave them a bit of food, he played with them, and then he put them back in the exact same buckets again. And what he found was fascinating. What he found was the average time that a rat would swim for until it gave up and died increased from 15 minutes to 60 hours. I know, it absolutely makes no sense. What he realized that if a rat had been temporarily saved, it would survive 240 times longer than if it had not been temporarily saved. And it doesn't make sense. Because surely as a rat, they'd swum and swum and swum and swum until the point that they were absolutely exhausted. So surely when they went in that bucket that second time round, they had no energy left, they were physically tired. But they swam 240 times longer. And Dr. Richter came to the conclusion that the rats were able to swim for longer because they had been given hope. They believed that they could survive because they'd done so before. And that hope made all the difference for them to survive in their harrowing circumstances again. They could survive because they had been saved. The rats had learnt that the situation that they were in was not actually hopeless, or certainly not as hopeless as they had previously thought. They knew what being rescued looked like, what being saved felt like and looked like. And so they kept swimming because of hope. And since Dr. Richter's very gruesome experiment, this whole field of behavioral psychology has opened up, which has found exactly the same. That when we have hope, it can carry us. And when we don't, we can drown. That is the power of hope. And so it's interesting here when Peter is writing to a people who are suffering, a people who are persecuted, a people who are disenfranchised and marginalized, a people at the edge of society, a people with no control over their circumstances, a people who I imagine felt very, very trapped, a people whose water was so deep and so dark and so cold and so unfamiliar and murky that they didn't know where they were going. That when Peter writes to them, he knows that it's very easy for us to lose perspective when our circumstances overwhelm us. And it's easy for us to lose that hope. Because what is interesting again with this passage is Peter doesn't promise them that their circumstances will change. Peter doesn't tell them how to change their circumstances. He doesn't say things are going to be different, but what he does is he gives them a way to live in their circumstances. And that is by not dwelling on the circumstances, but choosing to dwell on the hope that they have. Peter recognizes it's easy to forget our basic identity as Christians, of the hope that we have, of the end game, when we become consumed and overwhelmed by our busy and daily and sometimes difficult lives. He's reminding them of who they are and the hope that they have. He doesn't focus on the things that are uncertain and unchangeable. He focuses on what they have, the living hope. A hope that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading. He reminds them that no matter what you are going through, that God loves them and God is with them. And this is how you live as a Christian. Remember the hope that you have. Make that the center of your life. Everything you say and do should overflow from that place of assured hope. I had the privilege about 3 or 4 years ago of listening to Pastor Julie Kerr. She's at she was certainly at the time at Audacious Church in Manchester. And she specializes in mental health. She has got a master's in counseling and psychotherapy and has got a lot of clinical experience. And she talked to us about how for years, scientific studies believed that the number one predictor for mental health issues is family history. So if you're more likely to suffer from mental health issues if you've got a member of your family that has suffered from mental health issues. It's kind of hereditary. But actually what scientists have realized more recently, that is actually the second biggest predictor. The number one predictor for mental health issues is something called unhealthy rumination. Now, rumination is when we repeatedly go over a thought or a problem, letting it play over again and again and again in our minds. Rumination is repeatedly dwelling on something, saying to yourself things like, well, why did this happen to me? Or was it my fault? Or I'm worthless? Or something must be wrong with me. these are some unhealthy rumination thought patterns. Because you see, our brain is quite complicated. Scientists reckon that we process something like 400 billion pieces of information per second because of what we hear and what we see and what we touch and what we smell, and there's lots of sounds going on around us, so which do you filter out and which do you not filter out? And so what the brain does is it cleverly filters for us what it thinks is important to us, and it allows what it thinks it's relevant to us to come into our consciousness. Now, this keeps us from being flooded with irrelevancies and actually makes us be able to function as a human being, because we wouldn't be able to function if we were trying to process 400 billion pieces of information a second. But what's interesting is the brain bases its filtering of this information on deciding what is important to us by what we choose to focus our attention on. I remember many, many years ago buying my first car. And I'm not particularly interested in cars. They get me from A to B. It is what it is. And I remember going to the car showroom, supermarket showroom place, and I remember putting my deposit down on my first car, which was a white Fiat Cinquecento. Tiny little lunchbox-looking type car. And I loved that car. It was great. But the interesting thing was when I turned up to the garage and I'm looking at this car, I could have sworn I have never seen one of those cars before in my life. I hadn't recognized one of these cars ever. The minute I put a deposit on that car, I'm driving home, and every other car on the road was a Cinquecento. What's that about? If you've ever put your house up for sale, it's the same. You're driving down the road, and every other house seems to have a for sale sign outside. And you're like, but that's never been there before. It has. When we spend brain time, when our thoughts are actively directed on something, then our world becomes viewed through the filter of our focus. It's like we put on our moving house glasses or our buying a new house glasses, and suddenly all we see is relevant to moving house or buying a new car. Our brains are incredibly complex and clever, and they highlight what they know is important to us. So we start to see things that previously our brain had dismissed as irrelevant or unimportant, and it had pushed things into our unconscious. And it's not that they weren't there before. It's just that your brain, my brain, has filtered them out because it thinks that information isn't important to us. When we ruminate on our current circumstances, on our past, on what's happened to us, on our brokenness, on our fear of the future, then our brains will filter information that reinforces that negative view. And all we see is what we choose to ruminate on. It becomes self-fulfilling. We view our lives through the lens of our own ruminations. When our focus is not on God, not on our hope, not on our identity, not on the bigger picture, when we see the world or even ourselves through a distorted view of our current circumstances, our hurts, our experiences, our pain, our bitterness, our anger, that's when we start to drown. That's when we become overwhelmed. And so we need to take that discipline of taking captive of our thoughts. And this is something Paul says in 2 Corinthians 10, verse 5. He says, we demolish arguments and every pretension. Pretension is just another word for proud thing. So we demolish arguments and every proud thing that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take captive of every thought, making it obedient to Christ. And this seems to be what Peter is doing here in this passage. When he writes this letter, he's imploring the Christians not to focus on their circumstances. Don't ruminate on the things that you can't change, but take captive of those thoughts. Remember who you are. Remember your identity. Remember the hope that you have. Be aware of your own internal dialogue. Because our own self-talk, our own internal monologue is what directs our lives. I know I suffer from unhealthy rumination. I've been signed off work with anxiety. I've spent many a night up all night on no sleep, spiraling in my head, just absorbing myself in issues and things that are going on. Sometimes, absolutely, things have been not great and you could justify it. Other times, I just get spiraling on the most ridiculous, something you happened to say to somebody about 8 years ago and you wished you hadn't. You know, when you just lock yourself in that mental thought pattern. And I have to work hard to adjust my thoughts, to change the direction of my thought pattern. Because if I don't, I do quickly spiral. And for me, it's just recognizing that feeling, recognizing that negative thought pattern. And then I try and I choose to shift my thinking to what is good, to remind myself of the hope that I have. Because it's okay to have the thoughts. It's okay to feel anxious. It's okay to feel overwhelmed and out of control. But it's what we do with those thoughts. Do we ruminate on them? Do we allow them to fester and to take root deep into our hearts? Or do we, when we think those negative things, when we feel ourselves getting out of control in our thought processes, when we feel that anxiety, that internal dialogue going on, do we flip it? Do we flip it into our head, to our identity as children of God, to the hope that we have, to the bigger picture, knowing we are saved, believing God's promises, believing God's truths, standing firm on them and letting them be the foundation on which we build our lives. There's been loads of times in my life, but two really distinct ones for me. One was when I was going through a really difficult time in my life. And for me, I often even can't find the words when I'm praying. If things are really difficult, I haven't got the words. And I remember one time in my life, for me, it was Psalm 23. And when I felt that overwhelmed with circumstances and situations, felt isolated and lonely, I would just repeat Psalm 23 over and over in my head. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. And it just helped my focus. Another time was when my eldest son, he was about 11 at the time. Andy and I were sat downstairs, my husband, watching TV one Thursday night. And my house was quite noisy, two boys. And there was always loads of banging going on. There was a loud bang, and we did the usual, everything all right, lads? You know, from a call from the bedroom. And then Aidan, who was 9 at the time, sort of peeked his head round the lounge door and went, he's breathing. And we went, oh, that doesn't sound good. So he came out to find Ewan completely unconscious at the bottom of the stairs. No idea what happened. Nobody had seen it, or they've never admitted to it anyway, either of them. It's probably something brotherly anyway. Anyway, he was out cold for 20 minutes. We had to ring an ambulance. When he came round, he had no idea who he was, where he was. I mean, he was incoherent. It was one of the most terrifying moments as a parent of my entire life. And I remember being sat in that ambulance. Andy was driving in the car behind with him completely out cold, thinking, did he go unconscious before he fell down the stairs? Did he just fall out? What's happened? Is he going to be okay? And I just remember singing worship songs over him in that ambulance because I didn't have the words to say. And so my prayer was simply, at the time I think at church, the God of Angel Armies was a big worship song they were singing, and I just repeatedly sang over him worship songs. And it shifted my focus. It made the focus on God. I give this situation to you, and I trust in you, God. And that was how I got through those next few hours. And Peter says this is how we live in circumstances when we are trapped. We take captive of our thoughts. We choose to focus our attention on the hope that we have, on our identity, and not on our circumstances. Because when we know the outcome, when we know how this ends, it changes how we live now. He tells them in 1 Peter that they're on a journey. Their destination is guaranteed. They know who they are, where they belong. And so in light of that, they've got to live each day, live in the pain and the hardship of the now, in the knowledge of that hope, in the knowledge of that bigger picture. Because hope changes everything. It changes how long we will swim for in dark, murky, cold, unfamiliar waters. There is a living hope for all who want it. There is a hope that can change our perspective and the way we live in the midst of our difficult circumstances. There is a hope that because we have been rescued, allows us to face every day with the confidence of knowing the outcome. There is a hope that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading.